My interest here is, of course, is to talk to you about the changing world of police, community relations, and what I see is an environment now where everyone's always recording each other. But you mentioned to me that this, from your perspective, this isn't really new. Could you give us some history? How long have you been dealing with a public that's been recording you or your officers?
You know, I can think back at least 2 decades, and probably going back a quarter century, where there have been issues of the public taping the police. Way back when those first VHS recorders came out, they were big and bulky,
Right.
and people had to lean them on their shoulders. It was pretty easy to spot somebody that was taping you. But if you go back that long, we're talking in the
20 years.
Yeah, easily. So I don't view this as a new phenomenon. I do think that there are changes that have occurred recently that have brought this issue back to light. One of them is that now the police are taping encounters in the public. That, more so than anything else, has probably driven this discussion.
So you don't, a question I've asked a couple of your officers, about whether they view it, and all of them said yes, they commonly now encounter people recording them when
Right.
they're at a scene, an incident scene or whatever. I asked them whether they viewed it as confrontational, whether it was the public being more confrontational with police. Some said it depends on the circumstances. If things are tense, it can be. How do you view it? Is this as a police officer? Is this a pushback, or how do you view a public that wants to document every move you make?
I absolutely agree with what some of the officers have told you. I think it's situational in nature. There are a lot of instances where it just seems to be normal for people to pull out their cell phone, smartphone, and videotape an encounter with the police. But again, we're in a public, open area where, as long as people are lawfully at a location, videotaping the police is not unlawful at all. And again, the public has been doing this for quite some time.
You mentioned that something that is new is that the legislature passed the Right to Record Act this year, which not only affirms the public's right to record police, but it also sets up, as you pointed out, a damages process where if somebody feels like they've been unlawfully interfered with by a police agency, they can sue the department as opposed to the individual officer for up to $15,000. Can you comment on that? Is that?
I can, certainly. First of all, that was one of a number of bills that were submitted to our legislature, excuse me, which seemed to be part of a package of bills that were more reflective of things going on around the country earlier in this year, whether it was Ferguson, Missouri, or New York City, or Baltimore, or any other locations. There were things that were taking place around the country that I think affected some of our legislators. And they put together a number of bills that seemed to be aimed at curtailing or placing further parameters on the police. This bill in particular did reiterate the right of citizens to videotape police, where there has not been an issue of that for I don't know how long, a long time.
Right.
But it did suddenly place the police at a position where we would have to pay someone who complains that we have taken their cell device or photographic device, and they could make a complaint that they would want to recoup or sue the organization for up to $15,000. From my perspective, there were already ways for somebody to go about doing that through the court system, or contacting a city and dealing with those kinds of issues if they felt they had a claim. But this is one of the first times that I've seen a civil action placed against law enforcement, and I disagree with it.
Sure.
But having said that, the governor has already signed the bill, so we will live within the parameters of this new law, just like we certainly do with everything else.
Do you feel like police are under a spotlight right now? Because you mentioned that this seems to be a reaction to things national. It seems like in the last year or so, or 18 months, don't know why, we're seeing these live video incident things all the time, whether it's Ferguson or Baltimore or New York City or what's going on in Texas. Do you feel like police are under a spotlight?
Sure. And I guess I attribute that to 24/7 news. Nowadays, I'll give you an example. The shooting incident that took place in South Carolina earlier this year, that was an incident that years ago would have made local and regional news. It probably would not have elevated itself to a national news story. But now, almost anything can go from a local setting to a national news story or an international news story for that matter. I do think that there are 900,000 police officers in this country. I think that there is a chance every single day that there's going to be one of them involved in a situation that could be videotaped that may appear as if they weren't doing the right thing. So that places the police, all of us, in a position where we are under scrutiny. And again, I don't know that that's a bad thing, but it's the perceptions of some of these things that, create reactions such as some of these bills.
Sure. One of your officers said that, I said, well, what's it like to watch these incidents? And of course they all say, well, you understand you're only seeing a portion of what happened, so you keep it in mind. But he said it can be discouraging. When there's been an incident where you've seen a cop acting in a questionable way on TV, he says you just know you're going to come to work, and Pueblo's like any other town.
Sure.
It watches the news, and it's a discouraging feeling to feel like people are, watching for police to make mistakes. They're hyper vigilant for that.
Right.
Do you think that's a common sentiment among officers? That,
I think so.
When you're always on the news, whether it's somebody making a bad shooting or something like else, when you're going to come to work, you're going to inherit that. Or maybe Pueblo doesn't respond that way.
No, I think Pueblo is very much like other American cities, and they do react that way. And it is. I would agree with that officer's sentiment that they know that they're going to come to work, and there's going to be some discussion either at the officer level itself or in interactions with citizens. Some of these things will be brought up.
Can you share at all what it's like to be in the department when something like this happens? How do you guys talk about it among yourself? Do you critique what you saw on TV? Say, what was that guy thinking of? Or the public doesn't understand this is probably what happened first. But anyway, because how do you all respond when you see one of these incidents that goes 24/7 all week long?
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the recent ones. The fellow that was involved in the altercation with the New York City police officers, that there was a widespread discussion about a chokehold being used on that individual. And of course it ended, the result or the outcome was that individual's death. I know I watched that video and I thought it was horrible on a number of different levels. The next day or within 2 days, I banned the use of chokeholds in the Pueblo Police Department. So that was a direct result of how I felt watching that particular video. Now there's others as far as the the shooting, and I'll go back to that South Carolina incident where the officer shoots the fellow that's running away from him,
Right.
and he shoots him in the back. You know, you watch that video, and even as a police officer, or even more so as a police officer, you think of the training that you've gone through, and you wonder what was going through that officer's mind when he did that, because it really goes against all of our training. So, you know, whether it's myself coming into the office the next day and talking about those same exact scenarios with the deputy chiefs and the captains and my staff, or whether it's the officers talking about it at roll call, or us creating the discussion at roll call. I think that's a good thing for us to talk about these incidences and get it out on the table so that people can get a sense, our own officers can get a sense of
what your culture is.
Of not only what our culture is, but certainly for them to acknowledge that, wow, I mean, that looked wrong. Yeah. It looked wrong. There wasn't anything that looked right about it.
Do you think this 24/7 environment is going to have any effect on people wanting to become police officers? Do you think you're going to see a discouragement in the, like, oh, I don't want to do that if I'm always going to, you know, be having to explain myself, or what's your, or is that just the way young people are today? They just live in this constant technical society, and that's just what they assume? Well,
I think that's probably true. Okay. But I do think that it will have, you know, when you hear negative connotations about a profession, and you hear that repeatedly, I can't help but think that it will have an effect on our being able to recruit good and qualified individuals into the profession, let alone our ethnic minorities that we absolutely need to have in the profession as well. So, yeah, I think that there will be that kind of a result, or there could be.
Well, one of your officers said, you know, I said, how do you deal with it? He said, what bothers him sometimes is it's almost this need for people want a video that's going to go viral. So he said, most recently he was at a traffic fatality, and he said it bothered him that people were coming forward. They wanted video of, you know, sort of like the accident, the gruesomeness of it, or the, you know, and he said it bothered him because it didn't seem to show respect for what had happened. And he said it's almost like they're looking for that most, you know, dramatic video so that they can go online with YouTube and get 1 million hits. It's like everybody's a movie director suddenly, and they're looking for that fantastic little bit of video that's going to go viral, which is just a whole different mindset when you're dealing with a crowd watching, you know, who anybody might come around a police incident. I've been around police incidents enough to know I don't generally like to be at them. They're usually not good places. Something bad has happened, right. Either tragic or, you know, somebody's getting arrested, and yet folks seem to want to do this, you know, let's get the video, and that's just a whole different phenomenon that I have a hard time imagining having to deal with.
Well, I think it's just part and parcel of our environment today. You know, you mentioned young people today have grown up very much accustomed to dealing with computers and technical devices, cell phones. Realistically, I'm one of those people that I'm old enough to have remembered time before cell phones. Oh, yeah. And I know that life was pretty good. Right. Now, not only do I have a cell phone, but everybody has a cell phone, but we're always connected too. We are always engaged in some conversation with someone through the use of that cell phone, or we're receiving information through the use of the cell phone. And in some cases, I can see the absolute benefit of being able to get information out that quickly. But I also see that there's a lot of information that gets out that's not filtered, right. Quite frankly. Right. And it's not reviewed, if you will. So people get information in a wave, and it may not be factual in any way, shape, or form, but by the time they make up an opinion about it, you know, now they're moving on to something else.
Right. It's already out there with a life of
right.
its own.